Lock in. Lock in. Get it twisted? If you lock in, you can do anything. Motherfucker. Get it twisted. Your actions impact nothing. Your fate is predetermined. The only thing that you can change is your reaction to it. You can do anything you set your mind to. The world is a playground designed for you and only you to achieve your highest level ambitions. If you wait 90 minutes to wake up until you drink your first cup of coffee, nothing can stop you. If you duct tape your mouth when you fall asleep, nothing can stop you. Get it twisted? You are a pawn in a universe chess match. You mean nothing to God, if they even exist. You're a rounding error. You're 2 pennies on a Fortune 500 company's balance sheet. They don't care about you in the slightest. Get it twisted? Everybody gets what they deserve in this life. If you put in effort, you can achieve anything. Successful people are better people. Get it twisted? The circumstances surrounding your birth determine where you are going to go. Nothing else matters at all. Your own level of education, your attitude, your level of effort, your friends, your network, your business, your credentials. Motherfucker!
Why am I making you watch a middle-aged man roll a ball up a hill while surreal music pounds in the background and he spouts existential nonsense? Why are we sitting here delving into the mundane life story of a guy named Stanley?
This is the story of a man named Stanley. Stanley worked for a company in a big building where he was employee number 427. Employee number 427's job was simple. He sat at his desk in room 427 and he pushed buttons on a keyboard. Orders came to him through a monitor on his desk, telling him what buttons to push, how long to push them, and in what order.
And why is this man stuck in a cauldron, scaling impossible heights, with nothing but a hammer? These are all great questions. Questions that, if I'm feeling generous enough, I just might answer. See, I have a theory about postmodern existentialism, and it goes a little bit like this.
This is what employee 427 did every day of every month of every year. And although others might have considered it soul-rending, Stanley relished every moment that the orders came in, as though he had been made exactly for this job. And Stanley was happy. And then one day, something very peculiar happened. Something that would forever change Stanley. Something he would never quite forget. He had been at his desk for nearly an hour when he realized that not one single order had arrived on the monitor for him to follow. No one had showed up to give him instructions, call a meeting, or even say hi. Never in all his years at the company had this happened, this complete isolation. Something was very clearly wrong. Shocked, frozen solid, Stanley found himself unable to move for the longest time. But as he came to his wits and regained his senses, he got up from his desk and stepped out of his office.
Here's the thing about Sisyphus. He wouldn't last 5 minutes on Twitter.
All of his co-workers were gone. What could it mean? Stanley decided to go to the meeting room. Perhaps he had simply missed a memo.
I think the ancient Greeks might have had it backwards. See, it isn't Sisyphus who's stuck. It's that boulder. And it turns out, infinitely rolling is fun as heck. So fun that we've gamified it, that we've turned it into a video game where you, the player, can push a ball up a hill forever and ever and ever and really feel what it's like to be somebody.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
The Stanley Parable isn't just a quirky indie game released in the early 2000s, made by a tiny development team that few of you have probably ever heard of. Now, you might ask, why am I discussing an obscure video game in a philosophy class? And you'd be right. However, I think it offers perhaps the most visceral visualization of the existentialist problems. In the Stanley Parable, its protagonist Stanley is a faceless, legless, voiceless entity, trapped in a perpetual office-shaped hedge maze, his only connection to the world, the voice of a witty British narrator.
Feeling a wave of disbelief, Stanley decided to go up to his boss's office, hoping he might find an answer there.
Conception of what a game even is. On the surface, it appears to be a manifestation of the absurd, a game that doesn't really have an ending, and doesn't really have a beginning, and doesn't really have a narrative other than its hatred of narrative.
When he came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left. This was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well. Perhaps he wanted to stop by the employee lounge first, just to admire it. Yes, truly a room worth admiring. It had really been worth the detour after all, just to spend a few moments here in this immaculate, beautifully constructed room. Stanley simply stood here, drinking it all in. But eager to get back to business, Stanley took the first open door on his left. Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago.
A game that seems to go against all the rules of a game. A game that actively encourages you to break itself.
Look, Stanley, I think perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. I'm not your enemy, really, I'm not. I realize that investing your trust in someone else can be difficult, but the fact is that the story has been about nothing but you all this time. There's someone you've been neglecting, Stanley. Someone you've forgotten about. Please, stop trying to make every decision by yourself. Now, I'm not asking for me, I'm asking for her.
See, you'd think that would be absurd, but when you really think about it, it might actually be the least absurd video game ever made. See, the very act of playing a game is inherently absurd. Booting up a game of Tetris, seeing blocks fall over and over again, it's the visualization of insanity. It's the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again while expecting a different outcome. Expecting some new block to fall. It's like playing an open world game and searching for a thing that, you know, you're never actually going to touch or never actually going to see. It's truly doing nothing for no reason. It's inherently absurd. But, see, the Stanley Parable is aware of its absurdity and actually forces you, the player, to question your own relationship with the absurd. Your own relationship with what a narrative even is anymore. And it really emphasizes the modern question. What is anything?
This is it, Stanley. Your chance to redeem yourself, to put your work aside, to let her back into your life. She's been waiting. That's her, Stanley. You need to be the one to do this, to reach out to her. If you can truly place your faith in another, then pick up the phone
is that you? Hold on, sweetie. Sorry to keep you waiting. I'm just pulling the bread out of the oven. All right. Okay, there we go. All right, now, I want you to come in and tell me all about your day.
Gotcha! Oh, come on. Did you actually think you had a loving wife who'd want to commit their life to you? I'm trying to make a point here, Stanley. I'm trying to get you to see something. Come inside. Let me show you what's really going on here.
And the answer seems to be layered with self-awareness. It exists within its own realm of video games that have begun to question the bounds of our reality. What's interesting about the Stanley Parable is that it exists in a world obsessed with awareness. If we track back 40, 50, 60 years, narratives were reflective of their times. Before widespread literacy, people etched stories on cave walls hoping to convey meaning. But as society evolved and our basic needs were met, our desire for more complexity in our narratives has grown exponentially. Narrative, in many ways, suffers from the same phenomenon that affects any human endeavor. We're all in some ways subject to Moore's law. While originally about the exponential growth of transistors and circuits, the concept metaphorically applies to storytelling, i.e., the more we create, the more sophisticated our narratives become, and there's an exponential growth in this. The more narratives, the more the audience wants more compelling narratives. This exponential growth has led to an audience that is hyper-aware of narrative structures. Today, the average viewer is acutely conscious of the tropes and conventions that underpin storytelling. These days, some people don't even read books for the author. They just read books for the tropes. And realistically, there are only 7 basic story structures that are possible if we're being extremely generous. In reality, originality in the purest sense has been done for a long time. Everything is iterative. Everything is built off of this foundation of all the media that came before it. And yet that hasn't changed the problem. Audiences continue to crave media that challenges and interests them, despite the fact that the tools are not getting much better. And with limited tools at our disposal, people have been forced to get creative as we enter a new era of narrative. And this era is what I would describe as meta-narrative. Stories that are inherently self-aware and utilize the audience's understanding of the rules to subvert expectations. The Stanley Parable is one of the finest examples of this.
This is a very sad story about the death of a man named Stanley. Stanley is quite a boring fellow. He has a job that demands nothing of him, and every button that he pushes is a reminder of the inconsequential nature of his existence. Look at him there, pushing buttons, doing exactly what he's told to do. Now he's pushing a button. Now he's eating lunch. Now he's going home. Now he's coming back to work. One might even feel sorry for him, except that he's chosen this life. But in his mind, he can go on fantastic adventures. From behind his desk, Stanley dreamed of wild expeditions into the unknown, fantastic discoveries of new lands. It was wonderful, and each day that he returned to work was a reminder that none of it would ever happen to him. And so he began to fantasize about his own job. First, he imagined that one day while at work, he stepped up from his desk to realize that all of his co-workers, his boss, everyone in the building had suddenly vanished off the face of the earth. The thought excited him terribly. So he went further. He imagined that he came to 2 open doors and that he could go through either. At last, choice. It barely even mattered what lay behind each door. The mere thought that his decisions would mean something was almost too wonderful to behold. As he wandered through this fantasy world, he began to fill it with many possible paths and destinations. Down one path lay an enormous round room with monitors and mind controls. And down another was a yellow line that weaved in many directions. And down another was a game with a baby. And he called it the Stanley Parable. It was such a wonderful fantasy, and so in his head he relived it again, and then again, and again, over and over, wishing beyond hope that it would never end, that he might always feel this free. Surely there's an answer down some new path, mustn't there be? Perhaps if he played just one more time. But there is no answer. How could there possibly be? In reality, all he's doing is pushing the same buttons he always has. Nothing has changed. The longer he spends here, the more invested he gets, the more he forgets which life is the real one. And I'm trying to tell him this, that in this world he can never be anything but an observer, that as long as he remains here, he's slowly killing himself. But he won't listen to me. He won't stop. Here, watch this. Stanley, the next time the screen asks you to push a button, do not do it. You see? Can he just not hear me? How can I tell him in a way that he'll understand that every second he remains here, he's electing to kill himself? How can I get him to see what I see? How can I make him look at himself? I suppose I can't, not in the way I want him to. But I don't make the rules. I simply play to my intended purpose, the same as Stanley. We're not so different, I suppose. I'll try once more to convey all this to him. I'm compelled to. I must. Perhaps, well, maybe this time he'll see. Maybe this time. And I tried again, and Stanley pushed a button. And I tried again, and Stanley pushed a button. And I tried.
This works because of how games can elevate the narrative form through interactivity. As discussed in Aaron Smuts' paper on interactivity, this concept defines how we process and experience things. Movies and books are passive mediums. You control when you start and stop them, but you can't influence their beginning, their middle, and their end. All you can decide is whether to continue engaging with them. Video games, in contrast, change that dynamic entirely. You can interact with the world around you, controlling your destiny to some extent. You're no longer beholden to a single point of view or directorial vision. Your character's actions become your own, shrinking the distance between the audience and the medium to such a minuscule gap it can oftentimes feel as though you are the character. This is an evolution of the idea of the death of an author. When you release your work into the world, your intentions become secondary to the audience's interpretation. Words on a page don't carry universal intentions. They are subject to individual interpretation. Similarly, in video games, the control of the narrative rests more directly in the hands of the audience than ever before. This is the challenge of interactivity. In some ways, it challenges the idea of Heidegger's Dasein. The idea of being in the world gets kind of muddled when we're being in a digital world. This unlocks a new dimension of narrative, the second person. Traditionally, we have first person, third person, and all the various iterations of omniscient and nonfiction. But in this case, video games introduce this idea of the second person, a character that is not you, but is directly influenced by your actions. The Stanley Parable leverages this by presenting you with choices. The narrator instructs you to do certain things, and you, as the player, can decide whether to follow his guidance or forge your own path, effectively rewriting the story. This creates an intriguing conflict, where you're sometimes directly opposing the narrative being presented to you. It's as though you were reading a James Bond novel, but decided you don't like spies anymore, so instead of going to MI6, you chose to stay in the broom closet. indefinitely. This is now not James Bond, this is James Broom. This not only opens up infinite comedic possibilities, but also presents a fascinating dichotomy about the absurd nature of video games. On the surface, the Stanley Parable might seem to be the most absurd game. An Ouroboros consuming itself, actively rebelling against the idea of what a game is by refusing to have any absolute ending and presenting the illusion of choice. But perhaps that's the real truth here. Maybe the Stanley Parable is actually the least absurd game because it acknowledges its absurdity. Inherently, every video game is an absurd prospect. The idea of performing the same actions repeatedly while expecting a different outcome is both the definition of insanity and the premise of most games. Games like Minecraft exist in this odd space where they are inherently Sisyphean, prompting us to question our understanding of these actions and these stories that we've created. The notion that being trapped rolling a boulder up a hill infinitely would be hell is challenged by the fact that you can play a Sisyphus simulator right now and you can personally roll that ball uphill for as long as you'd like and test your mettle. And the reality is if you put on some fun music, it's actually kind of fun. What does that say about all of our founding interpretations of existentialism? In that realization, you're confronted with the potential meaninglessness of it all. And really, you discover that perhaps that's okay. Because maybe, just maybe, it's not really about reaching the end. It's about engaging with the experience, questioning the journey, and finding meaning in the absurd. Because, after all, we must imagine Sisyphus as happy.